Things Fall Apart, Chapter 22. Mr. Brown's successor was a Reverend James Smith, and he was a different kind of man. He condemned openly Mr. Brown's policy of compromise and accommodation. He saw things as black and white, and black was evil. He saw the world as a battlefield in which the children of light were locked in mortal conflict with the sons of darkness. He spoke in his sermons about sheep and goats, and about wheat and tares. He believed in slaying the prophets of Baal. Mr. Smith was greatly distressed by the ignorance which many of his flock showed even in such things as the Trinity and the sacraments. It only showed that they were seeds sown on a rocky soil. Mr. Brown had thought of nothing but numbers. He should have known that the kingdom of God did not depend on large crowds. Our Lord himself stressed the importance of fewness. Narrow is the way and few the number. To fill the Lord's holy temple with an idolatrous crowd clamoring for signs was a folly of everlasting consequence. Our Lord used the whip only once in his life to drive the crowd away from his church. Within a few weeks of his arrival in Umuofia, Mr. Smith suspended a young woman from the church for pouring new wine into old bottles. This woman had allowed her heathen husband to mutilate her dead child. The child had been declared an obanji, plaguing its mother by dying and entering her womb to be born again. 4 times this child had run its evil round, and so it was mutilated to discourage it from returning. Mr. Smith was filled with wrath when he heard of this. He disbelieved the story, which even some of the most faithful confirmed, the story of really evil children who were not deferred by mutilation, but came back with all the scars. He replied that such stories were spread in the world by the devil to lead men astray. Those who believed such stories were unworthy of the Lord's table. There was a saying in Umuofia that as a man danced, so the drums were beaten for him. Mr. Smith danced a furious step, and so the drums went mad. The overzealous converts who had smarted under Mr. Brown's restraining had now flourished in full favor. One of them was Enoch, the son of the snake priest, who was believed to have killed and eaten the sacred python. Enoch's devotion to the new faith had seemed so much greater than Mr. Brown's that the villagers called him the outsider who wept louder than the bereaved. Enoch was short and slight of build, and always seemed in great haste. His feet were short and broad, and when he stood or walked his heels came together, and his feet opened outwards, as if they had quarrelled and meant to go in different directions. Such was the excessive energy bottled up in Enoch's small body that it was always erupting in quarrels and fights. On Sundays he always imagined that the sermon was preached for the benefit of his enemies, and if he happened to sit near one of them he would occasionally turn to give him a meaningful look, as if to say, "I told you so." It was Enoch who touched off the great conflict between church and clan in Umuofia which had been gathering since Mr. Brown left. It happened during the annual ceremony, which was held in the honor of the earth deity. At such times the ancestors of the clan who had been committed to Mother Earth at their death emerged again as Ewuwu through tiny ant-holes. One of the greatest crimes a man could commit was to unmask an Ewuwu in public, or to say or do anything which might reduce its immortal prestige in the eyes of the uninitiated. And this is what Enoch did. The annual worship of the earth goddess fell on a Sunday, and the masked spirits were abroad. The Christian women who had been to the church could not therefore go home. Some of their men had gone out to beg the Ewuwu to retire for a short while for the women to pass. They agreed and were already retiring, when Enoch boasted aloud that they would not dare to touch a Christian. Whereupon they all came back, and one of them gave Enoch a good stroke of the cane, which was always carried. Enoch fell on him and tore off his mask. The other Ewuwu immediately surrounded their desecrated companion, to shield him from the profane gaze of women and children, and led him away. Enoch had killed an ancestral spirit, and Umuofia was thrown into confusion. That night the mother of the spirits walked the length and breadth of the clan, weeping for her murdered son. It was a terrible night. Not even the oldest man in Umuofia had ever heard such a strange and fearful sound, and it was never to be heard again. It seemed as if the very soul of the tribe wept for a great evil that was coming, its own death. On the next day all the masked Ewuwu of Umuofia assembled in the marketplace. They came from all the quarters of the clan, and even from the neighboring villages. The dreaded Otakagu came from Imo, and Ekwensu, dangling a white cock, arrived from Uli. It was a terrible gathering. The eerie voices of countless spirits, the bells that clattered behind some of them, and the clash of machetes as they ran forwards and backwards and saluted one another, sent tremors of fear into every heart. For the first time in living memory, the sacred bull roarer was heard in broad daylight. From the marketplace the furious band made for Enoch's compound. Some of the elders of the clan went with them, wearing heavy protections of charms and amulets. These were men whose arms were strong in owu, or medicine. As for the ordinary men and women, they listened from the safety of their huts. The leaders of the Christians had met together at Mr. Smith's parsonage on the previous night. As they deliberated, they could hear the mother of spirits wailing for her son. The chilling sound affected Mr. Smith, and for the first time he seemed to be afraid. "What are they planning to do?" he asked. No one knew, because such a thing had never happened before. Mr. Smith would have sent for the district commissioner and his court messengers, but they had gone on tour on the previous day. "One thing is clear," said Mr. Smith. "We cannot offer physical resistance to them. Our strength lies in the Lord." They knelt down together and prayed to God for delivery. "O Lord, save thy people," cried Mr. Smith. "And bless thine inheritance," replied the men. They decided that Enoch should be hidden in the parsonage for a day or two. Enoch himself was greatly disappointed when he heard this, for he had hoped that a holy war was imminent, and there were a few other Christians who thought like him. But wisdom prevailed in the camp of the faithful, and many lives were thus saved. The band of Ewuwu moved like a furious whirlwind to Enoch's compound, and with machete and fire reduced it to a desolate heap. And from there they made for the church, intoxicated with destruction. Mr. Smith was in his church when he heard the masked spirits coming. He walked quietly to the door, which commanded the approach to the church compound, and stood there. But when the first 3 or 4 Ewuwu appeared on the church compound, he nearly bolted. He overcame this impulse, and instead of running away, he went down the 2 steps that led up to the church, and walked towards the approaching spirits. They surged forward, and a long stretch of the bamboo fence with which the church compound was surrounded gave way before them. Discordant bells changed, machetes clashed, and the air was full of dust and weird sounds. Mr. Smith heard a sound of footsteps behind him. He turned round and saw Okeke, his interpreter. Okeke had not been on the best of terms with his master since he had strongly condemned Enoch's behavior at the meeting of the leaders of the church during the night. Okeke had gone as far as to say that Enoch should not be hidden in the parsonage, because he would only draw the wrath of the clan on the pastor. Mr. Smith had rebuked him in very strong language, and had not sought his advice that morning. But now, as he came up and stood by him confronting the angry spirits, Mr. Smith looked at him and smiled. It was a wan smile, but there was deep gratitude there. For a brief moment the onrush of the Ewuwu was checked by the unexpected composure of the 2 men. But it was only a momentary check, like the tense silence between blasts of thunder. The second onrush was greater than the first. It swallowed up the two men. Then an unmistakable voice rose above the tumult, and there was immediate silence. Space was made around the two men, and Ajofia began to speak. Ajofia was the leading Ewuwu of Umuofia. He was the head and spokesman of the 9 ancestors who administered justice in the clan. His voice was unmistakable, and so he was able to bring immediate peace to the agitated spirits. He then addressed Mr. Smith, and as he spoke, clouds of smoke rose from his head. "The body of the white man, I salute you," he said, using the language in which immortals spoke to men. "The body of the white man, do you know me?" he asked. Mr. Smith looked at his interpreter, but Okeke, who was a native of distant Umuru, was also at a loss. Ajofia laughed in his guttural voice. It was like the laugh of rusty metal. "They are strangers," he said, "and they are ignorant. But let that pass." He turned round to his comrades and saluted them, calling them fathers of Umuofia. He dug his rattling spear into the ground, and it shook with metallic life. Then he turned once more to the missionary and his interpreter. "Tell the white man that we will not do him any harm," he said to the interpreter. "Tell him to go back to his house and leave us alone. We liked his brother who was with us before. He was foolish, but we liked him, and for his sake we shall not harm his brother. But this shrine which he built must be destroyed. We shall no longer allow it in our midst. It has bred untold abominations, and we have come to put an end to it." He turned to his comrades. "Fathers of Umuofia, I salute you," and they replied with one guttural voice. He turned again to the missionary. "You can stay with us if you like our ways. You can worship your own God. It is good that a man should worship the gods and the spirits of his fathers. Go back to your house so that you may not be hurt. Our anger is great, but we have held it down so that we can talk to you." Mr. Smith said to his interpreter, "Tell them to go away from here. This is a house of God, and I will not live to see it desecrated." Okeke interpreted wisely to the spirits and leaders of Umuofia. "The white man said he is happy you have come to him with your grievances, like friends. He will be happy if you leave the matter in his hands." "We cannot leave the matter in his hands, because he does not understand our customs, just as we do not understand his. We say he is foolish because he does not know our ways, and perhaps he says we are foolish because we do not know his. Let him go away." Mr. Smith stood his ground, but he could not save his church. When the Ewuwu went away, the red earth church which Mr. Brown had built was a pile of earth and ashes, and for the moment the spirit of the clan was pacified. Chapter 23. For the first time in many years, Okonkwo had a feeling that was akin to happiness. The times which had altered so unaccountably during his exile seemed to be coming round again. The clan which had turned false on him appeared to be making amends. He had spoken violently to his clansmen when they had met in the marketplace to decide on their action, and they had listened to him with respect. It was like the good old days again, when a warrior was a warrior. Although they had not agreed to kill the missionary or drive away the Christians, they had agreed to do something substantial, and they had done it. Okonkwo was almost happy again. For 2 days after the destruction of the church, nothing happened. Every man in Umuofia went about armed with a gun or a machete. They would not be caught unawares like the men of Abame. Then the district commissioner returned from his tour. Mr. Smith went immediately to him, and they had a long discussion. The men of Umuofia did not take any notice of this, and if they did, they thought it was not important. The missionary often went to see his brother white man. There was nothing strange in that. 3 days later, the district commissioner sent his sweet-tongued messenger to the leaders of Umuofia, asking them to meet him in his headquarters. That also was not strange. He often asked them to hold such palavers, as he called them. Okonkwo was among the 6 leaders he invited. Okonkwo warned the others to be fully armed. An Umuofia man does not refuse a call, he said. He may refuse to do what he is asked. He does not refuse to be asked. But the tribes have changed, and we must be fully prepared. And so the 6 men went to see the district commissioner, armed with their machetes. They did not carry guns, for that would be unseemly. They were led into the courthouse where the district commissioner sat. He received them politely. They unslung their goatskin bags and their sheathed machetes, put them on the floor, and sat down. "I have asked you to come," began the commissioner, "because of what happened during my absence. I have been told a few things, but I cannot believe them until I have heard your own side. Let us talk about it like friends and find a way of ensuring that it does not happen again." Obwefi Ekwueme rose to his feet and began to tell the story. "Wait a minute," said the commissioner. "I want to bring in my men so that they too can hear your grievances and take warning. Many of them come from distant places, and although they speak your tongue, they are ignorant of your customs. Jamesi Yo and James, go and bring in the men." His interpreter left the courtroom and soon returned with 12 men. They sat together with the men of Umuofia, and Obwefi Ekwueme began to tell the story of how Enoch murdered an Ewuwu. It happened so quickly that the 6 men did not see it coming. There was only a brief scuffle, too brief even to allow the drawing of a sheathed machete. The 6 men were handcuffed and led into the guard-room. "We shall not do you any harm," said the district commissioner to them later, "if only you agree to cooperate with us. We have brought a peaceful administration to you and your people so that you may be happy. If any man ill-treats you, we shall come to your rescue, but we will not allow you to ill-treat others. We have a court law where we judge cases and administer justice, just as it is done in my own country under a great queen. I have brought you here because you joined together to molest others, to burn people's houses and their place of worship. That must not happen in the dominion of our queen, the most powerful ruler in the world. I have decided that you will pay a fine of 200 bags of cowries. You will be released as soon as you agree to this and undertake to collect that fine from your people. What do you say to that?" The 6 men remained sullen and silent, and the commissioner left them for a while. He told the court messengers when he left the courtroom to treat the men with respect, because they were the leaders of Umuofia. They said, "Yes, sir," and saluted. As soon as the district commissioner left, the head messenger, who was also the prisoner's barber, took down his razor and shaved off all the hair on the men's heads. They were still handcuffed, and they had just sat and moped. "Who is the chief among you?" the court messengers asked in jest. "We see that every pauper wears the anklet of title in Umuofia. Does it cost as much as 10 cowries?" The 6 men ate nothing throughout that day and the next. They were not even given any water to drink, and they could not go out to urinate or go into the bush when they were pressed. At night the messengers came in to taunt them and knock their shaven heads together. Even when the men were left alone, they found no words to speak to one another. It was only on the 3rd day, when they could no longer bear the hunger and the insults, that they began to talk about giving in. "We should have killed the white man if you had listened to me," Okonkwo snarled. "We could have been in Umuru now, waiting to be hanged," someone said to him. "Who wants to kill the white man?" asked a messenger who had just rushed in. Nobody spoke. "You are not satisfied with your crime, but you must kill the white man on top of it?" He carried a strong stick, and he hit each man a few blows on the head and back. Okonkwo was choked with hate. As soon as the 6 men were locked up, court messengers went into Umuofia to tell the people that their leaders would not be released unless they paid a fine of 250 bags of cowries. "Unless you pay the fine immediately," said their headman, "we will take your leaders to Umuru before the big white man and hang them." This story spread quickly through the village, and was added to as it went. Some said that the men had already been taken to Umuru and would be hanged on the following day. Some said that their families would also be hanged. Others said that soldiers were already on their way to shoot the people of Umuofia, as they had done in Abame. It was the time of the full moon, but that night the voice of children was not heard. The village Ilo, where they always gathered for a moon play, was empty. The women of Iwedo did not meet in their secret enclosure to learn a new dance to be displayed later to the village. Young men who were always abroad in the moonlight kept their huts that night. Their manly voices were not heard on the village paths as they went to visit their friends and lovers. Umuofia was like a startled animal with ears erect, sniffing the silent, ominous air, and not knowing which way to run. The silence was broken by the village crier beating his sonorous oene. He called every man in Umuofia, from the Akakanma age group upwards, to a meeting in the marketplace after the morning meal. He went from one end of the village to the other and walked all its breadth. He did not leave out any of the main footpaths. Okonkwo's compound was like a deserted homestead. It was as if cold water had been poured on it. His family was all there, but everyone spoke in whispers. His daughter Azima had broken her 28-day visit to the family of her future husband, and returned home when she heard that her father had been imprisoned, and was going to be hanged. As soon as she got home she went to Obiarika to ask what the men of Umuofia were going to do about it. But Obiarika had not been home since morning. His wives thought he had gone to a secret meeting. Azima was satisfied that something was being done. On the morning after the village crier's appeal, the men of Umuofia met in the marketplace, and decided to collect without delay 250 bags of cowries to appease the white man. They did not know that 50 bags would go to the court messengers, who had increased the fine for that purpose.